I'm Katherine Morn, and I'm the president and CEO of UUSC, and we are so glad that you all made the time to join us today for this really important conversation. I want to say right off the bat, sincere thanks to Maralena from No More Deaths. Maralena is the legal defense coordinator for No More Deaths, and we are really looking forward to hearing from her about the work that's going on and most especially updates from this last year. I want to start though with just a word about UUSC's history with No More Deaths. We are very proud to have been partners with No More Deaths since 2015. And Maralena, you might say a little more about this piece of it, but our first grant to No More Deaths was related to research that was being done on the disappearances and an effort to expose what was happening. And so that was our initial relationship with No More Deaths, and we've grown in our connections. I know from UUSC's point of view, it has been a real privilege, and we've learned a great deal from the work that No More Deaths has been doing these years. One thing I want to say in particular, because No More Deaths in some ways is just a perfect example of the kind of organization that we feel is very important to work with. And that's an organization that grew up in response to an immediate human need: disappearance, death, desperation in the desert, and was committed from the first moment to addressing the human need right in front of them, but not stopping there, but moving on to a vision of changing the systems that made the immediate human need, perpetuated the immediate human need. And so the way UUSC has supported No More Deaths primarily has been around that larger systemic work, working on advocacy and, as I said a moment ago, this research. So just last week, we got an email. We were pleased to hear that one of the ways that No More Deaths, and this is in addressing the immediate needs, one of the ways No More Deaths was able to use some of the support that many of you have helped provide was actually to purchase a new truck, to actually just be able to make and provide more direct service in the desert. So it's both of these pieces of work that No More Deaths does, and that we are so proud to be supporting them in the ways that we are able to. So Maralena, thank you again very much for being with us. We're really glad to have you. I'd love it if you would start just by giving a description of the work and mission of No More Deaths. What is it that you all are doing out there in Arizona?
Totally. Thank you so much for having us, Katherine, and thank you to everyone for being on the phone with us here today. I want to start by saying we really appreciate our partnership with UUSC and have really appreciated y'all's support, and it was amazing when y'all came out to join us last year. I get asked a lot what No More Deaths does, and it's sort of a half-hour-long answer, but I will try to be brief. So our organization is made up of multiple different working groups who all address different needs out in the field in different ways. The one we're most famous for is our Desert Aid Working Group, which is most well known for hiking water and food out to remote trails in the desert and places where we see evidence of people passing through and then leaving the water there for them to encounter on their journey. We offer medical care when we encounter people out in the field, according to our ability to offer it, and try to give people information about their options and the choices that they have. Another group we have is our abuse documentation group, which has been supported by UUSC, and that group started in response to just hearing people's stories from crossing and hearing people's stories in detention and learning about the sort of like all the different myriad ways that the border enforcement apparatus really seeks to strip people of their resources and their humanity and their options. So we've released a number of reports over the years. The one we're working on right now is a potentially turning into a 4-part report called The Disappeared, which talks about just different tactics the state uses to to produce this crisis of death and disappearance. The first report, the first series in the current disappeared report was about deadly enforcement practices, so the ways that actual, like, looking for people in the desert can lead to deaths and disappearances, most notably by like descending on people, like big groups of people, like through helicopters, and causing people to scatter and get injured and get lost. And the second installment was about Border Patrol's interference with humanitarian aid. And the third installment will be about what we call emergency non-response, which is about how even the leg of Border Patrol that is supposed to be about searching for lost people refuses to actually search for people, and the ways that enforces this crisis. We also do work in towns in northern Mexico, both supporting people after they've been deported, as well as trying to get resources to people who in shelters there that often don't have clean water or any food or any shelter structure or medical care. We also run a 24-hour missing migrant hotline where people can call in and get information. If they can share information with us if they have recent information about people who have gone lost, in which sometimes we can initiate a search and try to look for that person, or pressure Border Patrol or the sheriff to search for that person, or we can connect them with resources maybe to find their loved one in detention. And we also run a legal clinic in Tucson for people who lack, who are non-status and don't have documents, to sort of help them navigate that system and help them stay here with their loved ones. And then finally, we've been running this legal defense campaign for the past 1.5 years because our volunteers have been facing federal charges. So sorry, that's a lot of information in a short period of time, but we do a lot of things every day.
Thank you, Maralena. That's a great start. And I want to pick up on that point. And you mentioned when UUSC came out and we worked with UA and Love Resist, gather faith leaders to Faith Floods the Desert. I'm hoping a lot of the folks on the call are familiar with Faith Floods the Desert. But that was a response to these charges that arose. Can you tell the story about how that happened, what you believe triggered this new attention that the volunteers were getting, and why you feel No More Deaths has been targeted?
Yeah, so No More Deaths has had like an on and off, sometimes more and sometimes less antagonistic relationship with like all the different state actors in Southern Arizona over our 15-year history. And I think, you know, with the current administration that is so blatantly white supremacist and so blatantly anti-immigrant, that type of the antagonism has only grown on all sides. And I think things that felt politically impossible under previous administrations are being encouraged under this one. So for our volunteers facing misdemeanor charges, all of those charges are related to our attempts to have a presence in what's called the West Desert in Arizona, which is, a lot of that land is federally designated wilderness land. So we have been in conversations with land managers out there since we started operating there. And under the current administration, I think those land managers felt emboldened to sort of like press against the organization and use federal wilderness law to try to prevent our activities in that area. And I would say the same thing goes for Scott's case. Scott's case is like, was very notably political retaliation for the report that No More Deaths released. Like with the second installment of The Disappeared, we also released footage we'd gathered over 7 years of Border Patrol actively removing water from the desert, or taking over water gallons, or taking away food and blankets. And we put that footage out with the report, and it went viral on the internet, and millions of people saw it. And so it's a very clear link there between the way that we were vocally critical of this agency and the fact that like 6 hours later they arrested one of our volunteers.
I always like to stop when I'm sharing that story with people, because sometimes I think it doesn't even sink in that it's so stunning to hear that federal officials are being directed, presumably, to destroy humanitarian aid. I'm curious, were you all surprised when you discovered this, and or was that, had that been growing? I just can't imagine what it might have felt like to discover that this was happening.
I mean, I think since the organization has existed, I've heard stories, from people who helped found the organization and helped set up like Bird Camp, which is our desert aid station, like 15 miles north of the border. Like when people were first out there in 2004, 5, 6, 7, stuff like that, like there was no infrastructure. They were just out there in tents, and Border Patrol would like come drive around them in their like ATVs at like 2 in the morning and like scare everyone awake. So I think like really our relationship with local Border Patrol agents and our ability to at least like let each other do each other's work and not be actively antagonistic has really depended on the politics of the local sector chief and our relationship with them. So that has varied from sector chiefs who have been like, listen, I can't put anything on paper, but hands off, you guys do you, to sector chiefs who are like, no, I won't talk to you, I won't meet with you, I won't sign anything. So there's a lot of discretion, I think, but I also think that the current administration is really promoting, both like promoting through like propaganda and things that they're putting out, these type of actions, as well as like actually promoting people to offices who will condone these types of practices. But I do think it's really important to note that like the report was released under the current administration, and so I think a lot of people attributed Border Patrol's actions to a sort of political shift, but the footage we gathered was all under the Obama administration, right? So Border Patrol has been committing these abuses and performing this interference sort of like regardless of who might be in the White House.
So difficult to hear that and to hold that. So one of UUSC's human rights goals is around the criminalization of people based on their identities. And we're aware that, and this isn't a new reality, that people are criminalized by race and by property and by citizenship and so on. I think when we started this work, we wouldn't have guessed that also we would be considering the reality of criminalization of humanitarian work. So where are you all with that work? And just specifically, could you go over, I think most of our folks who are listening are aware of Scott Warren's, the charges against him and where his process is, but would you kind of, in a big way, go over the main points of that and talk about what your strategy is now related to that piece of it. We know the center of your work is lifting up the dignity of people and helping people survive who are making the journey. And now you find yourself devoting a lot of resources to this other piece related to doing the work itself. So just a little more background on that, and where are you now in the big picture strategy for that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think from the beginning when Scott was arrested and Scott and also 8 other volunteers were served court summons in sort of late 2017, and then Scott was arrested in January of 2018, we have, of course, wanted to come to the defense of our volunteers, and we've also been very aware of the way in which the prosecution of humanitarian aid workers is just an extension, or a local reporter called it like a widening of the blast zone around the criminalization of migration. And so we at sort of every step of the way been like, how do we lift up, our story, and like very validly, like the act of sharing water or leaving water for someone or offering someone food and water and clean clothes. Like, these should not be criminal acts, regardless of someone's status. And it's very dangerous precedent for them to become criminal acts. And at the same time, how do we not like take up the whole spotlight or like sort of play into a narrative of saviorism or heroism and make sure that like the folks who are like daily affected by the border crisis, like that's still who we're centering in our debates and like in the way that we sort of like talk about this work and present it. And so that said, I think there's been like strategy-wise, the, you know, a militarized border enforcement and migration being criminalized have such like, they've taken such hold in this country that it feels very difficult to know strategies, like sort of like political or policy strategies to combat that, right? Because like the center point, the center sort of starting point of the dialogue on a national level, you know, like is not about like whether Border Patrol should exist or not. It's about whether we should give them $5 billion or $6 billion, you know? So locally, our strategy has just been to like really lift up the fact that no more deaths exist, lift up the fact that there are folks crossing in the desert every day, try to talk to as many Southern Arizona residents as possible. And a lot of residents, you know, like are, I think, really hungry to know what they can do because they drive down the road and they encounter people or people knock on their back doors. And I think people who are living in the border zone are familiar in a daily way with the way that, you know, the way that this crisis is kind of happening in their backyards. And I think on a national level, we've got a tremendous amount of support and how to like funnel that support into effective political pressure. I think, you know, it's a question for No More Deaths, and it's also a question for most people doing organizing on the national scale right now because, you know, because Congress is so deadlocked and almost anybody who's a Trump appointee seems very, very immune to public pressure about most things. And most people who hold any type of official office, like, you know, there's some governors and mayors out there who I think are doing really effective stuff, but the actual reach of their ability to create safety for people or to stand against like these really inhumane policies is pretty limited.
Thanks. I want to go down one of those thought paths a little bit and then come back to Scott Warren. The question about and the reality that we don't even start with a question about the existence of Border Patrol. One thing that I have learned over the last couple of years that I just hadn't realized is around connecting the dots between 9/11 and ICE. And the time ICE has been in existence. I hear lots of people expressing real concern about how radical an idea it is to abolish ICE, which many of our partners are pushing for. But ICE hasn't actually, could you talk some about that and the change in the way we federally respond to migration?
Yeah, I'm not like a complete historian on the history of the Department of Homeland Security, but it didn't exist as an entity, as you said, before September 11th, you know, and I think I was actually at a talk the other night by author Todd Miller, who's coming out with a report that No More Deaths is co-sponsoring, and I'm afraid I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically about like sort of like the proliferation of border militarization and like a really sort of like high-tech version, high surveillance version of the way that like borders are being enforced. He wrote a report sort of like citing this proliferation like worldwide. And really in the talk, he talked about speaking with an official somewhere in the US government, and he asked them, how would you describe the way that border enforcement has grown since September 11th? And the official said exponentially. Exponentially is the word I'd use. So there were a lot of things that the Bush administration put into place that I think did really set us up for the moment that we're in now. And also, again, that were being put into place, like, you know, NAFTA, which was 1994, right, again, went into effect under Bill Clinton, and the base policy that No More Deaths has been organizing and fighting against of prevention through deterrence went into effect with NAFTA, right? So I think there's a you know, I think I and everyone is like, yeah, like, let's get this like horrendous foaming at the mouth white supremacist out of office, but that doesn't actually address and fix most of the problems, which, you know, have to do with like opening up our borders to the flow of commodities and closing them to the flow of people and families.
Thank you for that. So tell us, what is the status of the charges against Scott? What's going to be happening over the next months, and how is No More Deaths preparing for that?
Yeah, so Scott has had 2 federal trials so far this year, and now will face a 3rd in November. He had a misdemeanor trial in March of this year, and the judge for that trial is the same judge in the felony trial, Judge Collins. And Judge Collins has told us he's not going to release a verdict on the misdemeanor trial until the felony trial is over. So it is several months after March at this point, and we still don't know the verdict in that case. Starting at the end of May and going into
Marlene, could you qualify just what are the charges? So in case.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the misdemeanor charges, in Scott's case, I believe, were abandonment of property and driving on an administrative road, both of which are federal. They're usually treated, when someone commits this violation, they are given the equivalent of like a parking ticket or a citation, which is it's not considered criminal, it's considered like a civil violation. And so it's already a very sort of like hyped up political act to be prosecuting these violations as misdemeanor crimes rather than as just, you know, a citation. So Scott was charged. Scott drove out past a boundary, an administrative boundary on the federal wildlife refuge, where basically the only people who are like permitted to drive beyond that boundary are border enforcement officials and park officials. And he drove out past the boundary and left water for people. So that is what he's being prosecuted for. He did it in an area of the desert that is one of the most crossed and where there's some of the most recovered human remains found. So it's a real sort of like, when you look visually at the disbursement of where bodies are found in Arizona, it's a place there's a high concentration of that.
So that's that boundary, I guess.
Say what?
That's why he crossed that boundary, because you are.
That's why he crossed the boundary. Yeah. And that's in the desert outside Ajo, Arizona, which is where Scott lives and where he's lived, I think, since like 2012. So he's intimately familiar with the area, has done a lot of work out there. And then he has also faced federal felony charges since January of 2017, when he was arrested after we released a report. That trial happened late May, early June of this year. And those charges, for the first trial, he faced 2 counts of felony harboring for offering, the official Border Patrol complaint says offering food, water, clean clothes, and beds to 2 men from Central America, Jose and Christian. And then he also faced a charge of criminal conspiracy, which is another federal felony charge. So there were 3 charges overall. The trial lasted about 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for about 2.5 days before coming back and saying that they could not come to a decision. It was revealed afterwards that 8 of them were in favor of acquittal and 4 of them were in favor of conviction. And so at that point, the judge declared the mistrial, and the prosecution had about 1.5 months, I believe, to declare what they were going to do in the face of the mistrial. And we learned that they decided to drop the conspiracy charge, but retry Scott on the 2 harboring charges. So for the last trial, Scott faced up to a maximum penalty of 20 years in jail. And this time, because the conspiracy charges has been dropped, he faces up to 10 years in jail.
I see. Thank you. It's gotten a lot of attention. It must, I hope that you and Scott and all of the folks involved with No More Deaths have a sense of the outrage that's, that people are feeling and the support that we're sending. Have you had more people interested in your work? What's your crew of volunteers like? How has this affected what you're doing?
Yeah, we've got an incredible amount of support. I think we had a little bit of fear that these prosecutions would result in sort of like a dampening of people willing to do the work, and it's really been very different. I think with growing awareness, I think a lot of people are like, what can I do? What's happening at the border is so horrible, and No More Deaths can offer people a way to get involved and address that. We've definitely seen like an increase in the number of people wanting to come out and help us, and that's been really encouraging.
What do you look for in volunteers, and what kind of, could you tell the folks who are on the call what you're needing and how they could be involved if they wanted to be?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm sure you can tell based off of my 15-minute litany about what we do. There's a lot of different ways to get involved with No More Deaths. We do run a month-long program for people to come join us in the desert. And what we look for in that program are folks who have, you know, conversational and better Spanish skills, folks who have decent medical experience, and then also folks who, you know, are line and impacted community members who have family members who have migrated. So any of those can be really useful in that situation. I think that, you know, it can be slightly hard for us to know how to plug in volunteers who don't live in Southern Arizona otherwise. Like sort of like our volunteer program is the way you can come if you live elsewhere. We're definitely working still on, like, you know, Scott's retrial offers us another platform where we can voice our views and our opinions about what's going on. And we've definitely been like spending a lot of time thinking through whether there are any like national asks, congressional asks, policy pushes, or like other sort of like national administration recommendations that we would feel comfortable backing. We've been looking a bit and getting involved a bit with an organization, the Detention Watch Network, who's currently running a campaign, a really well thought out and hopefully very effective campaign, really pressuring congressional members to not grant ICE and CBP increased funding, because the narrative coming out of those agencies is that there's a humanitarian crisis happening at the border, and this is why they need more money. But the amount of money going to ICE and CBP has really also increased dramatically by the millions of dollars like every 6 months, and they just keep using that money to incarcerate more and more people. And as we all know, the incarceration conditions are like beyond inhumane at this time. So DWN is like really trying very hard to show congressional people that increased money doesn't equal like better enforcement or more humane conditions, which is really a thing we've seen, right? Like as Border Patrol's budget has grown, we have not seen them like go out and look for more people in the desert when we report it, right? Like the problem is not a lack of resources. The problem is institutionalized racism and abuse. So we've been thinking through whether there's like, you know, mobilizations we can like ask people to do in terms of like calling Congress members and stuff, and are still sort of in the middle of that strategy design. I'd also say I know like our fundraising team, because we've gotten so much attention, they're really swamped with a lot of like back-end administrative work. So if you're someone who likes writing thank you notes and making thank you phone calls, then we can always use help with that.
Nice, great. Thanks for that. I don't know if you saw, and I hope a lot of the people on the phone saw, a report that we did last summer called A Cautionary Tale. It actually was a research project that was initiated by our partners in Syria, in Hungary, talking about the parallels between the process of dismantling asylum systems that's going on around the world. Hungary has been a little bit ahead of the game in this regard, but our partners there in Hungary were eager to share the process that they were watching with us, because they could see that similar steps were happening in the United States as well. And one of the steps that they described that they had experienced was this criminalization of support. I was really thrilled to see on your Facebook, a Facebook post from No More Deaths, Maralena, about the captain of the ship trying to take Italy. Are you familiar with that? You might not have been. So my question is, first of all, you might tell folks a little bit about that situation and the parallels. And my question is, are you all in touch and making connections with people around the world who are experiencing similar judicial responses to your humanitarian work?
Yeah, so, I do think there is a parallel thing going on in Europe and, again, around the world at the moment. And Sea-Watch and Pia, the captain of Sea-Watch, I think is one of the most notable cases. Although there's been, over the past few years, I know there were Tunisian fishermen who were arrested for a while. I know there was a man in France who faced charges for guiding refugees through the Alps. We're currently in touch with a man in Ireland who was imprisoned in Greece for 100 days for offering humanitarian care. So I think there's a lot of cases out there, and I'm only aware of a small sliver of them and the ones that make any type of media. And I think that's another aspect that No More Deaths is thinking through is there's a national administration under which it's very difficult to get anything done. And then there is there's the global sphere and are there things that can be done at a global level or UN-based policy or whatever that would actually result in increased protection for migrants and for folks who are assisting them, right? I know those systems tend to move very slowly, and I know that our current administration doesn't care at all about international law. So those are definitely questions we're asking ourselves, but it's on our sphere, on our radar.
Great. And we're following too and looking for ways that we can support and engage and give folks an opportunity to be part of a response to that. So a lot of people on the call today don't live anywhere near Arizona, as you pointed out. And so I appreciated your speaking about the way you're developing strategies for advocacy opportunities for folks. Can you speak to, and maybe this isn't something that you're connected with particularly, but can you speak to direct ways that people can engage, the connections between what's happening at the border and what's happening in the rest of the country in terms of immigration and enforcement?
Yeah, you mean direct ways people can engage in their home communities? Yeah. I don't, my impression from looking at social media from my living room in Southern Arizona is that there are people across the country who are really trying to step up and help out folks in their communities who are facing deportation. I think that there's lots and lots of churches offering sanctuary. I think there's a lot of groups who are trying to do rapid response work. If you are an immigration lawyer, I'm sure you're already overtaxed and overworked, but if you're young and considering a career path, maybe consider becoming an immigration lawyer. But yeah, I think there's, as far as I can tell, in most towns around the country, there are people doing really amazing work to try to support families and support the ability of people to stay in their communities.
Yeah, it's one of the limitations of our setup today. But if we had the capacity to hear from the folks, the 70 or so folks who are on listening in, I'm guessing we would hear some really powerful stories about engagement. I know supporters are involved through their congregations, by hosting, being parts of accompaniment networks, and just general support with advocacy as well. So I just want to acknowledge and thank the folks on the call, not only for your support of UUSC, but also for everything you're doing to respond to the dreadful situation that's with immigration in this country that's just becoming worse and worse. So we didn't, you mentioned the other volunteers who were charged, had misdemeanor charges. Can you tell us what's the status for them, and are any of them facing fines or jail time? What happened with them?
Thanks. Yeah, so there were two other, besides Scott facing the federal misdemeanor charges, there were two other groups of 4 who were being tried together as groups. And the first group had their trial in January of this year. They were, all 4 of them, found guilty for the charges they faced and faced, I believe, $250 fines. Their cases, we're currently appealing those cases up to a higher court, and I believe that a circuit judge is deciding whether the appeals will merit oral arguments or not. It's actually happened before, no more deaths history, where local courts have convicted our volunteers, and then those convictions have been appealed at higher level courts. So we're hoping the same thing will happen. The second group of 4 was offered a deal by the prosecutors, which ultimately they ended up taking, which did drop the charges down to that like non-criminal violation level. And they did that in large part because that case was, they had crossed the boundary and driven out on the administrative roads on a search and rescue mission. And so the trial would have involved the government potentially subpoenaing family members of the person who had disappeared, and ultimately, in communication with the family, we decided it was better to protect their anonymity. And so that's why we sort of like ceded and took the deal the prosecutors has offered. I think if that hadn't been a situation, we would have rather fought it, but it felt more prudent to prioritize their needs. And some of those volunteers, some of them had already left the organization and were living elsewhere, and you know, really took the time out of their lives to come back to Tucson to have this federal trial and go through all of that, which I think shows the level of solidarity and commitment. So some of them are still here doing the work, and some of them are elsewhere doing good work other places.
Yeah, thanks. We got a question in the chat about the conditions outside of the United States that are creating the influx of migrants, and your work really doesn't transcend into, well, you said a little bit into Mexico, but not into Central America. I'll share just briefly, and some of our folks are aware that UUSC is in solidarity with some water defenders in Honduras, Guampanal, Honduras, who are currently being held, waiting for their trial, accused of disrupting the mining that's going on there, that is making it impossible for people in the community to have safe water. So they're trying to defend their community's right to live and are being charged for this. So we're watching that as that goes on. But more broadly, the situation in the Northern Triangle in particular is horrific for many people, with gangs, oppressive governments, impunity. Are you all engaged in many of those issues? We have partners in Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, and a couple of other places. How about your connections with work going on, or is your connection with the realities on the ground there more in terms of your relationships with folks who are crossing the border?
I would say both and. I mean, No More Deaths has been, at the moment, we have a number of staff members, which we have onboarded through necessity, but for most of our organizational history, we've been a collective of volunteers and are still volunteer-led and driven. And so everyone who comes to the organization, like most people, are also involved in some other form of political work. And so there's a lot of people who have traveled extensively in Central America or who have done other forms of organizing and support with groups who are working there. Organizationally, we have, I would say we have like a lot of individual connections, and occasionally definitely when asked to broadcast or support the organizing of folks in other places, we're really happy to do that in whatever way we can. And yeah, just to answer the question, like, yeah, U.S. has total responsibility. I mean, first through like, dirty CIA wars, and now increasingly through like being one of the biggest carbon emitters in the world, and the fact that like so many people are leaving their homes and their villages now because like they like literally like there's such a massive drought and they can't grow food, and like the climate crisis is like utterly disrupting their historical way of living and subsistence, right, as well as through the international trade agreements I mentioned earlier. So like U.S., the global north, these like sort of like, governments that are also corporations in disguise are the culprits that are like really upending people's lives.
Where do you get your hope for this work?
Ooh, hope. Well, my background before I worked with No More Deaths, I did a lot of climate organizing, and the organizing against the climate crisis while the climate crisis is unfolding, I think the ethic that I sort of landed on ultimately was like, just because you can't save something doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for, right? And so like to me, the mandate to like fight for a world that is a world that is like life affirming, and that like upholds, the sacred principles of like shared dignity and, sort of like the exchange of life and horizontality, like that's just part of what it is to be human. Like you can't be human if you're not doing that.
Thank you, Maralena. What a beautiful answer. So I'm going to look back now. I've asked a number of the questions that came from our members and folks who were interested in participating today. So let me look back and see if there are any that I missed. So volunteers, somebody asks, are volunteers still leaving water in the desert?
Yeah, totally. We're out in the desert every day. There's a lot of different areas of the desert that we go to, and we're sort of in an ongoing strategic discussion about how to best have a presence in the areas where volunteers were prosecuted for. But that's only one small area, and the Sonoran Desert is very big and vast. So we're still out there every day.
Thank you so much for your work and your wonderful partnership. Is there a way, are there things that we should be thinking about and learning about as we continue to deepen our engagement with the work, both UUSC and all of us on the call? Any last call that you'd like to make for us?
I think just as a last call right now, I would really encourage people to, like, the Congressional Appropriations process is happening right now, which will decide how much funding goes to the border for the coming year. And I think us at No More Deaths, while we're like deep in our own internal process about like what makes sense as our organizational ask, making sure there isn't more money going to incarcerate people feels really, really important right now. So if you could check out like Detention Watch Network, they've been using the hashtag defund hate, and they just have like a lot of amazing resources about how to talk to your congressperson about the way that like ICE keeps appropriating funds to expand its detention facilities.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I want to remind our folks about, for those of you who are aware, that UUSC is responding to the issues related to migrant justice with three objectives, three primary objectives, and we can kind of place them geographically. The first one is the right to stay. So that's the work we're doing that I was mentioning in Honduras and Guatemala and elsewhere, particularly in the Northern Triangle, to work with communities who are trying to disrupt the impunity and the suppression and the violence, particularly against women. And then the second objective is the right to move, the right to migrate. And so for safety along the journey, and that work we're doing in Mexico City and Guadalajara, with partners who are responding to the immediate needs of people traveling through, and also working with the government in Mexico around the horrific disappearances that are happening there. And then the right to asylum is the third goal that we're working on in our migrant justice work. And so a number of things are available on UUSC's website as well, related to the advocacy work around funding ICE, around temporary protective status, and other things that are, and this most recent decision happened yesterday, I think, from the Supreme Court to allow Trump's ban to stand while they are making a ruling on his declaration, which in effect would potentially bring asylum seekers to zero in the United States. There's a lot happening, a lot of ways we need to be responding, and working with partners like you, Maralena, is just such an inspiration. Somebody has asked if we can email Maralena, but I'm going to ask that you write to us at UUSC.
Info at UUSC.
The email to use is info@uusc.org. When we are introducing our partners and their good work, we know, and I think Maralena has kind of described this, that they are overwhelmed with the immediate needs they're facing. Some of them are really small organizations, but all of them with a lot of work to do. So we'll ask that you let us try to respond to your questions and make the connections that we might be able to make for you, so that we leave Maralena the space to do the work they're doing there in Arizona and in the courts and with their larger strategy. We share a commitment to dignity and to human rights. And Maralena, your work has really been an inspiration, and we want to remain at your side and following your lead in this good work. And we appreciate all that we've learned from you and all that you continue to do. I'll give you the chance for the last words, but I especially appreciate the foundation that you've shared for your work and how important it is for us to just stay at it. And in all of my time, my whole year, a little more than a year at UUSC, I have to say that my experience of being with you all and seeing you at work and watching you drive those of us who are amateurs out into the desert made it clear that your hearts are in this work, and your strength really helps many of us keep going. So thank you so much, and I will give you the chance for a last word if you'd like to have it.
Thanks so much, Mary Catherine. I just want to thank everyone who's on the phone and joined us today. I have no doubt a lot of you have been donating and supporting and sharing. No More Deaths, where if you want to follow along, we have a email list you can sign up for on our website, which is nomoredeaths.org. We're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. We did a pretty good job of trying to get out daily updates during the last trial, and we'll be doing that again this November. Scott's trial begins on November 12th. But beyond that, we're out in the field every day and are trying to just share updates and information about the situation out there. So we would love to have all of you just stay in touch and be in contact.
Thank you, Maralena. We're right there with you in spirit and in any way we can support you. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks, everybody, for calling in. We'd love your feedback. Send a note at info@UUSC. Let us know how this worked for you and what you'd like to learn more about in terms of human rights and our world. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.